Welcome to the pre-recorded webinar for Viola's Gardens Macro Workshop. My name is Amy Horn, and I'm going to take you through some of the gear and concepts just to give you a little bit of pre-knowledge prior to our fun day at the gardens. So let's start off with the basic definition and thought about what is macro photography. It's often generalized as small subjects, anything magnified or close up. And that can be very true for our workshop this time. We'll have several opportunities of not just a 1-to-1 ratio, but any form of magnification will work depending on what our subject is. So when I refer to a 1-to-1 ratio, I'm referring to the true definition of macro, and that is where the size of the subject on the image sensor is life size or greater, meaning 1-to-1 ratio. So if you were to put your camera at the minimum focusing distance, so the closest point it could focus, and have a ruler in front of you, if you can capture 36 millimeters on that ruler, that is the standard for a full frame camera, and for everything's based off full frame. So if you capture 36 millimeters of that ruler on your image sensor, then that is a 1-to-1 ratio. If you capture less than that, then you have greater than 1-to-1 ratio. So for instance, my Olympus crop sensor camera, I can capture 17 millimeters. Therefore, I'm getting a 2x magnification. So you can see the screen capture there of the 17 millimeters of a ruler on that page. When I refer to minimum focusing distance, depending on the subject, if you have a controlled environment like the image up here shows, the minimum focusing distance is that closest area to where your camera still focuses. So it's often easy in a studio environment to pull the subject closer or further to get that minimum focusing distance. However, at the gardens, that might be a little bit more difficult, and that's why we may not be shooting exactly 1-to-1. First, we want to consider our composition, what's going to make the most intriguing photo, as well as whatever we want to have magnified. But you may want to practice determining where your minimum focusing distance is, because often people can focus much closer with a macro lens than they ever thought they could. For this workshop, what gear is needed? So I will highly recommend a tripod, a shutter releaser timer, and preferably a macro lens. If you don't have a macro lens, then you can bring a long lens. So anywhere from 100 to 200 millimeters, possibly longer if you're interested in more of the, let's say, critters, as you'll see a few more images later. Other items, if you have them, are great to bring. These optional items like extension tubes. If you have a screw-on close-up filter, that can get you even closer on some subjects. Please try to bring a diffuser or a reflector. That will really make your images pop. And circular polarizing filters are very handy as well. Either black or white boards. I will provide some as well, but if you happen to have your own. And then a squirt bottle. And if you happen to have off-camera flash, I am going to do a short demo in the afternoon on how you can utilize flash, and give you an opportunity to practice that as well. So let's talk about the tripod and shutter release. So tripods are used to avoid any kind of camera shake, and because we are generally quite magnified, it eliminates any movement that we as the photographers might have. However, I am realistic. If for some reason getting around the gardens with a tripod is just more than you want to deal with, the workshop is about you enjoying yourself. So if you decide you need to shoot handheld, I will support that in every way that I can, help you to get those best images. And but a tripod is definitely very handy in many of the scenarios there. As you notice, a couple of the pictures here, the top center picture is of my tripod, and it has a center post that pops out, so that way allows me to shoot straight down on items as well. So if you have not played with your tripod, you might see if that is an option for your tripod. If you have a teeny tiny handheld tripod, like you see in the top picture in the top right, that might be a handy thing to bring, just because if you find something low to the ground, that might be easier to access versus the full standing tripod. And then a shutter release is very handy, but you could always use a 2-second timer instead. And all throughout the day, you want to be on the lookout. We have seen frogs before at this workshop as well. Okay, common focal lengths for macro lenses, anywhere from 60 to 180 millimeters. I think the 100 to 105 is really the sweet spot. 180 is great, but if you are going to hand hold, that can be a lot of weight. So definitely want to use a tripod if you're going to use at 180. But otherwise, the 60 millimeter to get highly magnified, you have to get very close to the subject. And sometimes in the garden beds, that's a little harder to do. So that's why I recommend anywhere from 100 to even up to 180, as long as you have a way to hold it. Extension tubes. So if you don't have a macro lens, a dedicated macro lens, extension tubes can provide magnification, because the more you extend the distance from the back of the lens from the sensor, you increase magnification. So in the case of the picture on the far right, I'm taking a picture of that yellow flower, and I have my small 60 millimeter Olympus lens. And then I also have two extension tubes in between the camera body and the lens itself. So by adding that distance, that space increases magnification. Now, the more you have extension tubes, the longer it makes your entire lens setup. So sometimes that can be pretty heavy. And you'll see in this next image, well, in just a moment, you'll see how that can be really difficult to keep on a tripod and keep stable. But to look at the difference between macro lens by itself versus with extension tubes, you see two sample images here. So the image on the left is just the macro lens. The image on the right is the extension tubes. Notice the more magnified you get, the less depth of field you have. So as I look at this image on the right, there's only a really small sliver of focus that is able to be captured. Whereas on this image on the left, a lot more is in focus, and it's all the same aperture in both images. So something to keep in mind. But if you have extension tubes, you might want to bring them and give them a try throughout the day, especially if you haven't used them much. If it ends up pretty windy, then extension tubes can be very difficult to use, but we never know what the weather will be until the week of the workshop. I can guarantee we'll have some breezes, because Flagstaff is known for that, but in the morning we'll have a lot less than in the afternoon. So here are the examples where you can see the actual extension tubes with the lens. So in the bottom image here, I get a much more magnified view of the flowers, and also a lot less in focus, a shallower depth of field, just by putting on those extension tubes on this Nikon setup. But look how long this whole lens setup is. So if I were extending the lens straight out, it could be a very good possibility there could be a little bit of camera shake. So something to keep in mind when it comes to pros and cons of extension tubes, especially if there's wind involved. And here's just an on-site example from the Boyce Thompson Arboretum with the Olympus camera. So I have an extension tube there with the 60 millimeter, and you can see how close I'm able to focus in on one of the spines right there. And if you don't have extension tubes, but you do happen to have some close-up filters, especially this is useful if you don't have a macro lens. If you have a macro lens, that would be sufficient. But sometimes people have some of these other things and they want to use them more because they haven't tried them. So I encourage you to bring them, and then we can give them a try. So close-up filters are often put onto a traditional lens. So especially if you're traveling and you don't want to take a separate macro lens, but you have these filters, this could be a great opportunity to spend an hour with practicing with them. But the filters, you have a generic close-up filter kit, often comes with 3 or 4 separate screw-on filters. The manufacturers often say you can stack them to get more magnification, but the image quality is really lost. So I recommend just using one at a time. Another screw-on filter that has pretty high quality, especially if you're going to use some focus stacking, and that's the Raynox. We use that quite a bit in some of our higher magnification applications. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the camera positioning and how you get what you want in focus. So you can see we will have some opportunities throughout the day of capturing critters in addition to the lovely flowers. And so your position to, especially a moving subject, is kind of critical in order to maximize that depth of field to get the most in focus. When it comes to little ladybugs, they are really big on scrambling around. They're often looking for water, and I will purchase some ladybugs that day to release for you all to photograph. And we'll spray down the plants ahead of time, so that way they stay a little bit longer and hopefully, grab some of that water as well. And then when it comes to the butterflies, just sort of predicting where they're at and moving your body around quickly to get, whether it's this more of a profile view like you see here, or if you're going to try to look straight on through their face, and what to focus on. So when it comes to macro, or anytime you're at closer magnification or higher magnification, closer to your subject, you have a shallower depth of field. So the plane of focus is critical if you want everything in focus. This is all part of the artistic decisions you get to make when you take a picture, but to just be aware. So if I was going to photograph this orange flower and I wanted a straight down shot, you can tell the plane of my lens is here and parallel is this way. The flower, however, is not on that same plane. As opposed to here, when on the picture on the right, when I rotated the camera lens just a little bit, it's now parallel to the flower. So what that means differently, if you look at these images here. So both images are fine. It just depends as an artist what it is you want out of the frame. So if I don't want this heavy blur in the foreground, then I need to make sure that I am shooting more on the same plane to maximize my depth of field so that more of everything is in focus. But again, that really varies on what you want with your image. So feel free to experiment with that, but certainly keep that in mind, because the last thing you want is to come home and have pictures that are not as sharp or have as much depth of field as you originally wanted. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your focus point, your aperture, and your shutter. So your camera has so many different settings and options, but things to be familiar with is, can you move your focus point around? So in a case like this, shooting on a tripod, I found this little, I think it's a little Viola, and I just liked how it was popped up above many of the others. I loved how the light was hitting it. So I started off with a pretty shallow depth of field, a wider open aperture, and I moved, this was the frame I captured, so I moved my focus point to focus on this flower right here. So it wasn't a center point focus, I actually moved it up here. And if you're on a tripod, that's the most efficient way to go about things. And so I tend to use single point of focus when I'm photographing more static subjects such as this. And then with the shallow depth of field, that's how the background has gone out of focus. Now, there are situations where you might want to really pay attention to your shutter speed. If this was a windy scene, then I would want to make sure my shutter speed was at a certain minimum of at least maybe 1/60th or 1/100th of a second to make sure I still get stop motion in case the wind is causing some movement. Or when I photograph any of those butterflies or ladybugs or something like that, that's going to be critical too. So I referred to your aperture settings, and of course, with a wider open aperture, like at f2.8, then that throws the background out of focus. And at f16, we get more of the background in focus. But in these two comparisons, this image on the left is a single capture at f16, and I still don't have all of these anthers totally sharp. Whereas the image on the right is a focus stack. And so with a combination of, I think it was about 10 to 15 images here, using a wider open aperture, then those are stacked in post-production in software. So it's a personal preference, but it's something to consider. As I mentioned, the closer you get to your subject, the shallower the depth of field you can achieve, even if you stop down the lens. And of course, as soon as you stop down the lens, the background will get more in focus as well. So you'll have to make some choices, what it is you want. I will do a demo during lunch about focus stacking and introduce that concept to you, and then have some follow-up videos after the workshop in case you want to stack anything you've captured. So just to give a basic idea of focus stacking for those that might be new to this, is you take separate slivers of focus And so in this case, with all of these lines would represent separate individual images. And then using Photoshop or special software, I tend to use Helicon, but I'll demo how to do it in Photoshop and provide a video how to do it in Photoshop. And then you just stack and combine those together to make one image. Sometimes many mirrorless cameras, most all of them except Sony today, have some form of focus bracketing or focus stacking feature in your camera. So feel free to look at your camera manual, figure out what it might be called. Nikons have it, that all the mirrorless ones in the D850s, Canon R5s, R6s have it. Like I said, Sony's about the only one. I think there's only one model that happens to have it on the Sony. And then even Fuji offers some focus bracketing. So if you have not used it before, at least find out if your camera has it. Get familiar with where it is in the menu, and then I can work with you that day if you are interested in trying to do that. So both of these images were captured in camera using the focus stacking feature. So with both of these, I set the camera to capture 15 images. I set my focus point, I pressed the shutter, and the camera took 15 images and combined it and spit out this JPEG. All finished. I also have the option under focus bracketing. I'm not limited to just 15 photos. I could take up to 999. When I'm on location, like we will be at Viola's, generally the most I would take is 10 to 15 images. I'm certainly not going to try anything more than that. There's going to be other elements like wind or sunshine, stuff like that, clouds that might change. So it's going to be a lot harder to stack. So mine will always be short little stacks if I'm doing it on location. When I am shooting my studio, then that would be an opportunity to take a much larger stack. You can do simple stacks such as these, 2 image stacks. So the first image was focused on the stem, the next one on the petals, and then the third one, they're combined. Really quick, really simple. Just move your focusing point from one image to the next, and then you can do a stack when you're done. Same thing here. So again, if you have some interest in focus stacking or bracketing, just find out if your camera has it, or just be open to the instruction and I'll help you out with that. All right, a couple additional things that you might want to bring if you have it. I will have a few extra spray bottles, but if you happen to have one, it's always a good thing to keep in your camera bag. And so you can see the image on the left, that was just sprayed with a spray bottle of water on, I think it's geranium there. And then, of course, I mentioned the diffuser or reflectors. Both of those are handy, especially the diffuser, because we tend to get some harsher sun at certain parts of the day. I have even had some participants bring an umbrella to hold over themselves, and then they can possibly even shade their subject too. And then we'll talk about polarizing filters as well as backgrounds. So diffusers, this gives you some sample images just to understand the difference in the look. So sometimes the harsher shadows and the harder light, like in the first image on the far left, is what you want, what you see as a creative person. Other times you might want that diffusion. So if you have that smaller diffuser, I like to use, I think mine's a 20-inch diffuser, so it folds up nicely like your car shade, but it's not real huge and it's easy to fold up and collapse. And in the case, you can see the picture on the right from my house garden. I've also diffused the background because you can see over here, there's some light in the background. So I made sure that that was also diffused because our eyes are drawn to the brightest spot of a frame. So we certainly don't want it to be the background because then our viewers will not even look at the subject. All right, circular polarizing filter. I wouldn't say you need to go purchase one of these. However, if you have one, I would bring it. And always check if you have one, make sure it works for your macro lens. So for instance, depending on your camera manufacturer, let's say you have a polarizing filter, either a 77 millimeter or 82 millimeter in diameter. That's a pretty standard one because people will use them for landscapes and use them for, with their landscape lens, which tends to be 77 or 82 millimeter. But your macro lens, maybe it's only a 58 millimeter or a 72, something different. You do not need to buy a new polarizer. You can buy what's called is a step-up ring. They're about $10 to $15. Amazon or most any camera store would have them too, B&H. Anyway, so you get the size based on the macro lens. So for instance, let's say mine is a 58 millimeter lens. So my macro is 58 millimeters. I'm going to get a step up that goes from 58 to 77 because my polarizing filter for my landscape lens is a 77 millimeter. So with this little $15 metal ring, I can use that polarizer on multiple different lenses. So if you do have one, doesn't quite fit your macro lens, take a look at that. And this would be a great time to pick up one of those step-up rings. But it will minimize reflections on the water. With water or the plants, you can see how much richer the tones are in this image on the right and how much less reflection we have. In post-production, you can reduce highlights and do a few things to mimic this look, but it's a lot easier if you have that filter to just go for it. If you are looking to purchase a filter, feel free to reach out to me and I can recommend a few. I like Stingray filters, but I also have used a lot of B+W filters too. So feel free to reach out. Backgrounds. You always want to kind of consider the background. I mentioned if the background is bright, you also want to consider if the background is busy. So here's another couple images that were taken from my backyard, and the bumblebee was checking out and pollinating these chive flowers. The image on the left with the additional purple just doesn't work quite as well. Plus, I'm not as engaged with the bumblebee. But by watching the behavior and moving myself around a little bit, it took not very long, and all of a sudden I have a much more engaging image. Background is cleaner, simpler, and I even have connection with the face. So although a lot of the day will also be on just the flowers, not moving subjects like a bee, it's something to just keep in mind what could be distracting in the background. So if you have something distracting or you just want something different, this is what our foam board backgrounds would be used for, or if you have colored paper and even using a diffuser for it. So the center image here is the actual flower captured at Viola's in one of their gardens. This was a flower for sale. So we're not going to use anything to clip to the plants like a Wimberley plant or anything like that, because these are all for sale and we can't risk damaging any kind of flowers. But in the case here, I captured the image and I kind of like the background. But you know, what if I wanted one on a white background? Maybe I wanted to do a cutout and do something different with it, or just add some text to the image in post. While I'm all set up, you can see a little bit in this picture on the far left, I just threw my diffuser in the background and that became a white backdrop. Now, sometimes I had to overexpose the image to make sure the white was really rendered nice and white, because sometimes our metering systems don't like when we have bright white in an image. But this is one of the challenges that we will work on throughout the day as well. But so if you have that white or black board, you can do some creative different things as well on location. A couple other things I will challenge you all throughout the day. So about every hour we'll come back together, talk about what we captured, and then I'll send you out with some kind of new challenge. And of course I'll send you out, but yet I walk around and help you throughout the day too. But one of the challenges we will have is like the image on the bottom right. We're going to shoot through. So we'll use some other flowers in the foreground to have that nice, soft, little blurred depth of field in the foreground there. Kind of adds a little more surreal or dreamy quality. If you happen to have a cool knee pad, like the image on the far left, I encourage you to bring that. Sometimes you might want to be low to the ground, and comfort will always make better images than if you are not comfortable. So feel free to bring one of those knee pads. And then we will spend some time looking at textures and critters throughout the day. So you've already seen some of the critters, but we often see a variety of moths and butterflies, bees, on occasion hummingbirds. Of course, you probably always have the macro lens on when all of a sudden the hummingbird comes nearby, but you can macro lenses, not only do they shoot close up, they do also have a longer focal length. So depending on the distance you are from the hummingbird, you might be able to just pick up that camera and still shoot at the same time. Or if you want to take a half hour and just search for birds, depending on what we are seeing that day. It is your workshop, and I want you to get the best that you can get. So in addition, the textures and critters, so I like to look at different details. The picture on the top left looked good in color, but I decided black and white would really make the difference in the textures stand out more. Over here, I really love the shadow with these overlapping petals. And so you'll be encouraged to find different perspectives throughout the day as well. And it is an active garden, so we'll be very careful where we set up our tripods, making sure people can walk behind us and get through and that we're not in anyone's way. We're not going to have all 5 of us in one location at the same time. We will spread out so that way Viola's doesn't have any problems with us being there. But sometimes I find there's some neat images with just the items they have for sale, like the pots in the top right, or the image on the left, the blue in the background is actually a big blue pot, and the flowers just happen to be cascading over the edge. So really pay attention to different colors and shapes. Obviously, the image on the far left, actually both of these images, neither of them are macro images, but I can just step away with my macro lens, use it as more of a long lens to get that image. Or if I wanted, I could change lenses as well. So Sunday, July 14th is our day. It is on a Sunday because they often have weddings on Saturdays. And so I ask that you arrive in the parking lot about 8:45 for introductions. I will take you into the gardens at that point, and we'll start on with hands-on photographing plants and flowers until our lunch break. So we do have access to the building during lunch. If there is nothing else scheduled for the day, that they might allow us to use the room in addition to lunch. But right now we could only reserve the lunchtime in case they have some other activity. Someone else is renting it out. And so we will want to keep all of our gear with us. You always have access to get back to your car if you wanted, but try to keep as much of the gear with you as possible. It's not a huge location, so we'll always be able to keep an eye where our gear is if you do decide to just leave it on the patio. So we kind of meet at the patio area where a lot of the wedding receptions and weddings are held, but most of the customers don't go over there. They spend the time in the actual gardens looking at the plants. So I'll discuss that more in depth when we get there. Lunch is included in this workshop, so I will reach out with phone calls in a few weeks and have a lunch menu sent out to you ahead of time so I can record your lunch order, and then we'll have lunch brought into us. And after lunch, we will go back out in the gardens with a couple more challenges. And again, that's where if you do have an off-camera flash, that would be a handy thing to have for one of those challenges. If you don't, that's totally fine as well. And after the workshop, I will offer post-workshop critiques. So I will review your images during lunch on the back of your camera and all throughout the day. But after the workshop, you'll have a chance to really download and do your own editing and post-processing and then get feedback at that point. So that is our day. And please record my phone number. So if I do call, it doesn't just get completely ignored. I will leave a voicemail too. So if you don't recognize the number, that works too. Just listen to your voicemail and you can give me a call back. Also, if you have any problems the morning of or delays, then you can give me a call at that point. And I think that I've covered it all. So if you do end up with further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Just drop me an email. And as I said, I'll be calling each of you prior to the workshop. And this workshop is full, and we have 5 people on it. So it's a nice, small, intimate group, and I think we're going to have a great time. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in July.